At 72 years old, I thought I knew what betrayal looked like. I'd weathered my husband Tom's sudden heart attack, raised 3 children through their rebellious teenage years, and survived more family drama than most people see in a lifetime. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the morning I woke up in an empty house in Riverside, Oregon, with a note on the kitchen counter that would shatter my world. My son David, his wife Lisa, and my precious grandchildren Emma and Jake had packed up and left for their dream vacation to Hawaii. Without me. After they'd convinced me to sell my beloved home on Maple Street and move in with them just 3 months earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Kate Thompson, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are capable of the deepest cruelty. It's also the story of how I discovered that rock bottom can become the foundation for something stronger than I ever imagined possible. The whole nightmare began 6 months ago with what seemed like the most generous offer in the world. I was sitting in my kitchen on Maple Street, the same kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals for my family over the past 45 years, when David knocked on my door with that particular expression he wore when he was about to ask for something big. He had Lisa with him, which should have been my first warning sign. Lisa rarely accompanied David on his visits to see me, claiming she was always too busy with the children's activities or her part-time job at the local veterinary clinic. David settled into Tom's old chair at the kitchen table, the one I still couldn't bring myself to move even though my husband had been gone for 2 years. Lisa perched on the edge of her seat like a bird ready to take flight, her manicured fingers drumming against her purse strap in a nervous rhythm that made my teacup rattle against its saucer. "We've been talking, Mom," David began, using that gentle tone he'd adopted since Tom's death, the one that made me feel like a fragile china doll instead of the woman who'd raised him with more backbone than sense. "Lisa and I have been discussing your situation here, and we're worried about you living alone in this big house." I set down my teacup with deliberate care, feeling the familiar prickle of irritation that came whenever my children tried to manage my life. "David, I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. This house isn't that big, and I know every creaky floorboard and stubborn door handle like old friends." Lisa leaned forward, her voice taking on the practiced sympathy she used with anxious pet owners at the clinic. "Kate, we know you're independent, and we admire that. But winter's coming, and you had that fall in the garden last month. What if something happens and no one's around to help?" The fall had been minor, a slip on wet leaves that resulted in nothing more than a bruised ego and muddy knees. But somehow it had become family legend, growing in severity with each retelling until you'd think I'd tumbled down Mount Hood. I was about to defend myself when David pulled out his phone and showed me a series of photographs that made my breath catch in my throat. "These are pictures of the house Lisa and I are looking at on Oak Ridge Drive," he said, swiping through images of a beautiful 2-story home with wraparound porches and mature oak trees. "It's got 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and there's a perfect suite on the main floor that would be yours. Your own bedroom, your own bathroom, even a little sitting area where you could have your books and Tom's chess set." The house was stunning, far grander than anything David and Lisa could afford on his salary as a high school history teacher and her part-time veterinary assistant wages. I studied the photos with growing confusion and a strange flutter of hope I didn't want to acknowledge. "How could you possibly afford this?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Lisa and David exchanged one of those married couple looks that communicate entire conversations in a single glance. "That's the thing, Mom," David said carefully. "We can't afford it. Not alone." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "But if we combined our resources, if you sold this house and came in as a partner on the new place, we could make it work. You'd own 1/3 of the property, have your own space, but also have family around all the time." The idea was seductive in ways I hadn't expected. Since Tom's death, the silence in my house had become oppressive. I found myself leaving the television on just to hear human voices, and I'd started having entire conversations with Tom's photograph on the mantelpiece. The thought of hearing Emma practice violin in the evenings, of Jake's sneakers thundering up and down stairs, of family dinners and holiday celebrations filled with laughter instead of echoes, made my chest tight with longing. But something in Lisa's expression, a carefully controlled eagerness that didn't quite reach her eyes, made me hesitate. "This is a big decision," I said slowly. "I'd need time to think about it, maybe talk to Tom's friend at the bank about the financial implications." "Of course," David said quickly. "Take all the time you need. But there is one thing, Mom. The house we're looking at, it's in a really competitive market. The sellers have already had 3 offers, and they're planning to make a decision by the end of the week. If we're going to do this, we'd need to move fast." Lisa nodded vigorously. "Kate, I know it seems rushed, but this house is perfect for our family. Emma could have her own room instead of sharing with Jake, and there's enough space for everyone to have privacy when they need it. Plus, you'd be helping us give the children opportunities we couldn't provide otherwise." The gentle manipulation was expertly done. Appeal to my desire for family connection, emphasize the children's needs, create artificial urgency, and make me feel like the generous matriarch solving everyone's problems. Looking back, I can see all the red flags clearly. But in that moment, sitting in my quiet kitchen with the autumn light fading outside and 2 years of loneliness weighing on my shoulders, it felt like a lifeline. I agreed to think about it overnight, but honestly, my decision was already made. The next morning, I called David and told him I was in. The speed with which everything moved after that should have alarmed me. Within 2 weeks, I had accepted an offer on my house, contributed my portion of the down payment for the Oak Ridge property, and begun the emotional process of packing up 45 years of memories. My neighbor and best friend Maggie Chen stood in my living room watching me wrap Tom's chess pieces in tissue paper, her expression troubled. "Kate, are you sure about this?" She asked for the 5th time that week. "It's not that I don't think living with family is wonderful, but selling your house seems so final." Maggie had been my closest friend since we'd both moved to Riverside as young wives in the 1970s. She'd helped me through Tom's diagnosis and death, had been my partner in countless church committees and community projects, and knew me better than my own children did. Her concern carried weight because it wasn't based on sentiment, but on practical wisdom earned through 7 decades of life. "It's going to be fine," I assured her, though I was really trying to convince myself. David and Lisa have thought this through carefully. Emma and Jake need more space, and I need family around me. It's a win-win situation. Maggie picked up one of Tom's chess pieces, turning the carved wooden knight over in her weathered hands. "I just hope you're not giving up too much independence for the promise of company. Sometimes the things we think we want aren't the things that actually make us happy." Her words stayed with me as I continued packing, but I pushed my doubts aside. David was my son, my baby boy who'd grown into a thoughtful man with a good heart. Lisa might not be the warmest person in the world, but she'd never been unkind to me. And Emma and Jake were the lights of my life. Bright, funny children who filled every room with energy and possibility. The move itself went smoothly, though I was surprised by how much of my furniture David and Lisa deemed unnecessary for the new house. My dining room set, which had hosted every family Christmas for decades, was too formal for their casual lifestyle. Tom's favorite reading chair didn't match their aesthetic. Even my grandmother's china cabinet was relegated to storage because it would make the kitchen feel cramped. I found myself in a beautiful bedroom suite with my clothes in an unfamiliar closet and my most precious possessions arranged in spaces that didn't quite feel like home. But Emma and Jake were delighted to have Grandma Kate living with them, and their excitement made the adjustment period feel worthwhile. The first month was everything I'd hoped for. Emma would knock on my door after school to tell me about her day, curling up in my reading chair while I made her a snack and listened to teenage drama that seemed monumentally important in the moment. Jake included me in his elaborate Lego constructions, patiently explaining the engineering principles behind his architectural masterpieces. David would sit with me in the evenings, talking about his students and sharing stories about his day that reminded me of the curious, thoughtful boy he'd been. Even Lisa seemed more relaxed, less guarded than she'd been during our previous interactions. She'd ask my opinion on dinner menus and include me in conversations about the children's school activities. For the first time since Tom's death, I felt like I was part of a living, breathing family again, instead of a lonely widow marking time in an empty house. But slowly, subtly, things began to change. It started with small things that were easy to dismiss as normal household adjustments. Lisa began preparing meals without asking if I had dietary preferences or restrictions. David stopped including me in decision-making conversations about household matters, even though I was technically a co-owner of the property. My suggestions about family activities were met with polite smiles and gentle redirections toward whatever had already been planned. I told myself these were growing pains, natural adjustments as we learn to live together as an extended family. I reminded myself that David and Lisa had their own way of doing things, their own family rhythms that I needed to respect. I convinced myself that my feelings of displacement were selfish, that I should be grateful for the opportunity to be close to my grandchildren instead of focusing on minor inconveniences. The first real warning sign came in early December, about 2 months after I'd moved in. I was sitting in the living room reading when Lisa's sister Jennifer came to visit. I'd met Jennifer briefly at family gatherings over the years, but we'd never had extended conversations. She was a real estate agent in Portland, confident and polished in ways that made me feel dowdy and old-fashioned. Jennifer was admiring the house, praising David and Lisa's decorating choices, and commenting on how much space they had. The children were upstairs doing homework, and David was grading papers in his study, so it was just the three of us women in the living room when Jennifer made a comment that stopped my heart. "Lisa, you were so smart to structure this arrangement the way you did," Jennifer said, settling back into the couch with her wine glass. "Having Kate contribute to the down payment while keeping the mortgage and deed in your and David's names protects your investment and gives you flexibility for the future." I looked up from my book, feeling a strange buzzing in my ears. "What arrangement?" I asked, my voice sounding far away to my own ears. Lisa's face flushed pink, and she shot her sister a sharp look that could have cut glass. "Jennifer's a real estate professional, Kate. She's just commenting on the legal structure of our home purchase." But Jennifer, apparently oblivious to the tension she'd created, continued chatting. "Oh yes, and when you eventually want to downsize, or if Kate's situation changes, you won't have to deal with complicated co-ownership issues. It's really the smartest way to handle these kinds of family financial arrangements." The room felt like it was tilting sideways. According to Jennifer, I wasn't a co-owner of the house at all. I was essentially a long-term house guest who had contributed a substantial sum of money for the privilege of living in someone else's home. The legal and financial security I thought I'd gained by combining households with my son had never existed. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my beautiful bedroom suite, feeling like a fool. How had I been so naive? How had I trusted so completely without asking the right questions or demanding to see the legal documents? I'd been so eager for family connection, so desperate to feel useful and wanted, that I'd handed over my financial independence without proper protections. The next morning, I asked David if we could have a private conversation. We sat in his study, surrounded by his teaching materials and family photos, while I struggled to find words for the betrayal I was feeling. "David," I said carefully, "I need to understand the legal arrangements for our house purchase. Jennifer mentioned some things yesterday that confused me." His expression shifted slightly, becoming guarded in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the teenager who'd been caught sneaking out after curfew. "Mom, the important thing is that we're all here together as a family. The legal details are just paperwork. But the legal details determine my security, David. If something happens to you or Lisa, if you decide you want to sell the house, if we have a disagreement about living arrangements, where does that leave me?" David stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that was pure Tom. "Nothing's going to happen, Mom. We're family. We take care of each other." The non-answer felt like a slap. I pressed harder, asking specific questions about ownership percentages, my name on the deed, and what financial protections I had as someone who'd contributed significantly to the purchase. David's responses became increasingly vague and defensive, until finally he snapped. "Mom, you're acting like you don't trust us. After everything we've done to include you in our lives, to give you a place in our home, you're treating us like strangers who might cheat you." The accusation stung, because it contained just enough truth to be effective. I was questioning their motives, doubting their integrity, behaving like someone who expected to be betrayed. But the fact remained that I'd given up my independent housing and contributed a substantial sum of money based on what I now realized were deliberately misleading representations. I backed down that day, apologizing for my suspicions and promising to trust that everything would work out fairly. But something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. I began paying closer attention to family conversations, listening for clues about plans and decisions that affected me. I started noticing how often I was excluded from discussions about household finances, vacation planning, and long-term family goals. Christmas came and went, with elaborate celebrations that felt slightly hollow. I helped with cooking and cleaning, bought generous gifts for everyone, and played the role of grateful grandmother living in her son's beautiful home. But underneath the festive surface, I was beginning to understand that my position in the family was far more precarious than I'd realized. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in late January when I overheard a phone conversation that Lisa probably thought was private. She was in the kitchen talking to someone, her voice carrying that particular tone of conspiratorial excitement that women use when sharing secrets. "Hawaii is definitely happening," Lisa was saying. "David's been working on Kate, getting her comfortable with the idea of assisted living. We found this really nice place called Pine Valley that specializes in independent seniors. It's not a nursing home, more like a retirement community with activities and social opportunities." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. They were planning to move me to assisted living, not because I needed care or had become a burden, but because they wanted me out of the house. The generous family invitation, the beautiful bedroom suite, the promises of building a life together, had all been temporary measures to get access to my money and establish legal control over the property. The conversation continued, and I learned that they'd been planning a family vacation to Hawaii for months, funded in part by the money I'd contributed to their house purchase. They'd already made reservations, already arranged for Emma and Jake to miss school, already decided that I wouldn't be included because, as Lisa put it would be easier to transition me to Pine Valley while they were gone, so I could get settled in my new environment without the emotional difficulty of saying goodbye. I stood frozen in the hallway outside the kitchen, listening to my daughter-in-law discuss my future like I was a piece of furniture to be relocated for their convenience. The betrayal was so complete, so coldly calculated, that I couldn't even feel angry. I just felt numb, like someone had reached into my chest and removed something essential. That night, I called Maggie from my bedroom, keeping my voice low so no one would overhear. When I told her what I'd discovered, the silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Oh, Kate?" Maggie finally whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know what options I have. I sold my house, Maggie. I gave them almost everything I had, and now I'm finding out that, legally, I have no claim to anything. If they want me gone, I think they can just put me out." The reality of my situation was stark and terrifying. At 72 years old, I was essentially homeless and financially vulnerable, dependent on the goodwill of people who had already demonstrated they were willing to manipulate and deceive me. The life I'd built over 7 decades had been reduced to whatever I could fit in a few suitcases, and the small savings account I'd kept separate from the house sale. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the family sleeping peacefully around me, something began to shift inside me. The numbness was giving way to something harder, more focused. I might be 72 years old, and I might have been naive enough to trust the wrong people, but I wasn't helpless. I'd survived raising 3 children, building a marriage, losing a husband, and dozens of other challenges that had seemed impossible at the time. David and Lisa might think they'd cleverly maneuvered me into a position where I had no choice but to accept whatever they decided was best for me. But they'd underestimated the woman who'd raised their family, who'd built a life from nothing, and who still had fight left in her. The next few days passed in a strange sort of suspended animation. I went through the motions of normal family life, helping Emma with a school project, listening to Jake's stories about his basketball team, participating in dinner conversations about everyone's day. But underneath the surface, I was planning, thinking, preparing for whatever came next. I was about to discover that sometimes the worst betrayals come from the people we love most, and sometimes those betrayals become the catalyst for finding strength we never knew we had. The morning after I overheard Lisa's phone conversation about Hawaii and Pine Valley, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had been clouding my judgment lifted, replaced by the sharp focus I remembered from my younger days when I'd managed a household budget on Tom's modest teacher's salary, and somehow made everything work. I had been played, manipulated with surgical precision, but I wasn't going to go quietly into whatever retirement home they'd selected for my convenience. I started my investigation the way any smart woman would, with paperwork. While David was at school and Lisa was at the veterinary clinic, I searched through the kitchen drawers, where they kept household documents. My hands shook slightly as I pulled out file folders containing mortgage papers, insurance documents, and property tax assessments. Every page I read confirmed my worst fears. The house was titled solely in David and Lisa's names. The mortgage was their responsibility alone. According to every legal document I could find, I was nothing more than a houseguest who'd made a substantial financial gift to help with their down payment. The betrayal was even more complete than I'd imagined. Not only had they misrepresented my legal status as a co-owner, but they'd structured the transaction in a way that gave me absolutely no recourse if things went wrong. I wasn't a tenant with rights, wasn't a family member with legal protections, wasn't even a co-signer with financial obligations. I was simply an elderly woman who'd been generous enough to help her family buy a house, and naive enough to believe their promises about shared ownership. I photographed every document with my phone, feeling like a spy in my own supposed home. The mortgage application particularly stung because it listed my contribution as a family gift rather than an investment. David and Lisa had literally told the bank that I was giving them money with no expectation of return, which meant they'd been planning this deception from the very beginning. Every conversation we'd had about partnership and shared ownership had been theater designed to get me to hand over my life savings willingly. When I finished with the financial documents, I moved on to the more personal evidence of their planning. Lisa's laptop was sitting open on the kitchen counter, still logged into her email account. I knew I was violating her privacy, but at that point, I figured they'd already violated mine in far worse ways. What I found made my stomach clench with nausea. The email correspondence with Pine Valley Assisted Living went back 4 months, long before they'd even approached me about selling my house. Lisa had been researching senior communities, asking about availability, pricing, and admission requirements for someone with my health profile and financial situation. The facility coordinator had sent detailed brochures and even a preliminary assessment form that Lisa had partially filled out with information about my daily living skills, social needs, and medical history. But the emails that really broke my heart were the ones between Lisa and her sister Jennifer about the timeline for my relocation. They discussed the optimal moment to suggest assisted living, how to present it as being in my best interests, and strategies for managing my emotional resistance to the idea. Lisa had written that she thought I'd be more receptive to the transition after I'd had time to settle into their house and feel grateful for their hospitality. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. They deliberately created a sense of security and belonging, knowing all along that it was temporary. Every family dinner, every included conversation, every moment of apparent acceptance had been part of a timeline designed to soften me up for eventual abandonment. I had been managed like a difficult project, rather than loved like a family member. The Hawaii vacation emails were perhaps the most painful, because they revealed how little consideration they'd given to my feelings about being excluded. Lisa had written to the travel agent that they'd need accommodations for 4 people, mentioning that David's mother wouldn't be joining them because she was transitioning to a new living situation. The casual dismissal, the matter-of-fact tone, made it clear that my exclusion wasn't a difficult decision that had caused them anguish. It was simply a logistical detail to be handled efficiently. I sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of my own stupidity and their methodical deception, and felt something I hadn't experienced since Tom's death. Raw, burning anger. Not the sad resignation I'd been carrying for months, but actual fury at being treated like a disposable convenience by people I'd loved unconditionally. The anger felt cleaner than the confusion and hurt I'd been drowning in, more useful than the self-pity that had been eating at my confidence. My phone rang while I was still processing the scope of their betrayal. Maggie's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with a voice that sounded steadier than I felt. "Kate, how are you holding up?" Maggie asked without preamble. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night, and I've got some ideas about how to help you figure out your options." Maggie, I said, my voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard from myself in years. I need to tell you what I've discovered this morning. They've been planning this for months. The assisted living, the Hawaii trip, getting rid of me. This whole thing was orchestrated from the beginning. I filled her in on everything I'd found, reading her selected passages from the emails and explaining the financial documentation that proved my complete lack of legal protection. Maggie listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of disgust or disbelief that helped me feel less crazy for being so thoroughly deceived. Kate, Maggie said when I finished, her voice tight with controlled anger. I've known David since he was a little boy riding his bike up and down Maple Street. I watched you raise him with more patience and love than most children ever receive. This isn't just about money or legal contracts. This is about basic human decency, and what they're doing to you is cruel beyond belief. Her validation meant everything to me in that moment. I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was being overly sensitive or unreasonably demanding. But Maggie's outrage confirmed that my feelings were justified, that what was happening to me was genuinely wrong rather than simply unfortunate. What do I do now? I asked, feeling lost despite my earlier surge of determination. I've got maybe $30,000 left in savings, no house, no legal claim to this property, and a family that's actively planning to dump me in assisted living while they vacation in Hawaii. First, Maggie said firmly, you don't let them railroad you into any decisions while you're still processing this. Second, you get some legal advice from someone who specializes in elder law and family financial disputes. And third, you remember that you're Kate Thompson, the woman who raised 3 children while working part-time at the library, who nursed Tom through his final illness without losing her mind, and who organized half the charitable events in Riverside for the past 20 years. You're stronger than they think you are. Maggie's pep talk helped, but I still felt overwhelmed by the practical challenges ahead of me. At 72, starting over felt impossible. The housing market in Riverside had changed dramatically since I'd sold my house, with prices rising beyond what my remaining savings could cover. Most apartment complexes had income requirements that would be difficult for someone on a fixed retirement income to meet. And the social isolation of living alone again after tasting family life once more seemed almost unbearable. But as I sat in their kitchen, surrounded by evidence of their deception, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't going to make this easy for them. If David and Lisa wanted me out of their lives, they were going to have to face the consequences of their choices directly, rather than manipulating me into compliance with their timeline. I spent the rest of the day conducting my investigation with methodical thoroughness. I found vacation itineraries hidden in David's desk drawer, travel confirmations for flights leaving in 10 days, and hotel reservations for a 2-week stay at a luxury resort in Maui. They'd planned everything down to the smallest detail, including arrangements for someone from Pine Valley to pick me up and help me move my belongings while they were conveniently absent from the state. The most damning evidence came from Lisa's phone, which she'd left charging on the kitchen counter while she ran errands. I felt only a moment's hesitation before scrolling through her text messages, looking for conversations about their plans. What I found exceeded even my worst expectations. Lisa had been texting with David's sister Patricia, who lived in Seattle and rarely visited. The message thread revealed that Patricia had been kept informed about the entire scheme from the beginning, and had even offered advice about how to handle my inevitable emotional reaction to being relocated. Patricia had suggested that they present the assisted living facility as a temporary solution while I adjusted to Tom's death, making it seem like a therapeutic step rather than a permanent abandonment. But the text that made my hands tremble with rage was one Lisa had sent just 3 days earlier. Patricia had asked how I was adjusting to the news about Hawaii, and Lisa had responded that they hadn't told me yet, but that it would be fine because I'd be settled in Pine Valley before I even realized they were gone. She'd added that I was becoming somewhat difficult anyway, asking too many questions about finances, and seeming less grateful for their hospitality than she'd expected. The casual dismissal of my concerns as ingratitude, the calculation involved in timing my abandonment, the coordination with extended family members who'd never shown interest in my welfare, all of it painted a picture of conspiracy that went far beyond simple financial manipulation. They weren't just taking advantage of my loneliness and naivete. They were actively working to eliminate me from their lives, while maintaining plausible deniability about their motives. I made copies of everything, uploading photos to a cloud storage account that only I could access. If this situation was going to escalate into a legal battle, I wanted documentation of their planning and intentions. I also wrote down a detailed timeline of events, from their initial approach about selling my house through the discovery of their Hawaii planning, creating a record of how the deception had unfolded over time. By the time Emma and Jake came home from school, I had composed myself enough to interact normally with them. They were innocent victims in this situation, children who had no idea their parents were capable of such calculated cruelty toward their grandmother. Emma bounced into my room as usual, chattering about her chemistry test and the drama in her friend group. Jake showed me a drawing he'd made in art class, a family portrait that included me standing next to him with a big smile. Looking at that drawing, seeing myself represented as an integral part of Jake's conception of family, nearly broke my resolve to handle the situation with dignity. These children loved me genuinely, without calculation or agenda. They'd welcomed me into their daily lives with the pure acceptance that only children could offer. The thought of suddenly disappearing from their world, of becoming another adult who'd abandon them without explanation, made me feel sick. But I also realized that staying silent and allowing myself to be manipulated wasn't protecting them. It was teaching them that family members could be discarded when they became inconvenient, that elderly people had no rights or dignity worth respecting, that promises could be broken without consequences as long as you had legal power over the vulnerable party. That evening at dinner, I watched David and Lisa interact with their children with normal parental affection, while simultaneously planning to traumatize those same children by suddenly removing their grandmother from their lives. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. They could compartmentalize their cruelty toward me while maintaining their identities as loving, ethical people in every other area of their lives. David asked me how my day had been, his voice carrying the same casual interest he'd shown every evening since I'd moved in. I looked at him across the dinner table, this man I'd raised from infancy, whose skinned knees I'd bandaged and whose homework I'd supervised, and marveled at how completely I'd failed to recognize his capacity for deception. "It was fine," I said, my voice steady. I did some organizing in my room and caught up on some reading. Nothing too exciting for an old lady like me. Lisa smiled at my self-deprecating comment, probably interpreting it as evidence that I was accepting my role as a peripheral family member who should be grateful for basic inclusion. She had no idea that I'd spent the day documenting her betrayal and planning my response to their manipulation. After dinner, I helped clean the kitchen while Emma practiced violin in the living room, and Jake worked on homework at the dining room table. The domestic scene was so normal, so perfectly representative of the family life I'd thought I was joining, that for a moment I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the evidence of their deception. Maybe I'd misunderstood the emails, misinterpreted their planning, allowed my own insecurities to create a conspiracy where none existed. But then Lisa's phone buzzed with a text message, and I saw her smile as she read it. She showed the screen to David, and they shared one of those married couple looks that excluded everyone else in the room. When David grinned and gave her a thumbs up, I knew they'd received some confirmation about their Hawaii plans, probably final confirmations for activities or restaurant reservations that would make their vacation even more enjoyable. The casual happiness on their faces while they planned to abandon me solidified my resolve. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a failure of communication. This was deliberate, calculated betrayal by people who decided I was dispensable once I'd served their financial purposes. Later that night, I called Tom's old friend and attorney, Bob Martinez, at home. Bob had handled our wills and estate planning for years, and I trusted him to give me honest advice about my legal options. When I explained the situation, leaving out no detail about their deception or my own naivete, Bob was quiet for so long I thought he might have fallen asleep. "Kate," Bob said finally, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I'm going to be straight with you because that's what Tom would have wanted. Legally, you don't have many options. If the property is titled in their names alone and you can't prove you were promised an ownership interest, your financial contribution would likely be considered a gift, even if you could prove they misrepresented the arrangement. Pursuing legal action would be expensive and emotionally devastating for your family. I'd expected that answer, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch to the stomach. So they can just take my money and throw me out, and there's nothing I can do about it? Not exactly nothing, Bob said carefully. You could potentially file a claim for financial elder abuse, especially if you can document that they used misrepresentation to obtain your money. The fact that they're planning to place you in assisted living against your wishes while they vacation could support a case for emotional abuse as well. But, Kate, even if you won such a case, it would destroy your relationship with your son and grandchildren permanently. The choice Bob was presenting felt impossible. I could fight for justice and lose my family, or I could accept injustice and lose my dignity. Either way, the loving family relationships I thought I was building were already gone, destroyed by David and Lisa's willingness to prioritize their comfort over my welfare. What would you do, Bob, if this were your family? Bob sighed deeply. I'd probably do exactly what you're going to do, Kate. I'd try to find a way to protect myself while preserving whatever relationship might still be salvageable with those grandchildren. But I'd also make damn sure that David and Lisa understood the full consequences of their choices, legal and otherwise. After I hung up with Bob, I sat in my beautiful bedroom suite, surrounded by the few possessions I'd been allowed to bring from my old life, and made a decision that scared me with its boldness. I wasn't going to wait for them to spring their Hawaii trap on me. I wasn't going to passively accept relocation to Pine Valley while they enjoyed the vacation my money had helped fund. And I wasn't going to protect them from the social consequences of abandoning their elderly mother. I was going to take control of this situation, even if it meant burning down the bridges I'd been desperately trying to preserve. Sometimes the only way to maintain your dignity is to refuse to participate in your own humiliation, regardless of the cost. The next morning, I began executing a plan that would either restore my agency in this situation or explode my family relationships beyond any hope of repair. But at 72 years old, after decades of putting everyone else's comfort ahead of my own needs, I'd finally reached the point where preserving my self-respect mattered more than keeping the peace. They wanted to treat me like a disposable burden? Fine. But they were about to discover that this particular burden had more fight left in her than they'd calculated. The morning of reckoning arrived with deceptive normalcy. David was humming while making coffee, Lisa was packing lunches for the children, and Emma and Jake were their usual chaotic selves, searching for homework and arguing about who had used whose pencils. I sat at the breakfast table, watching this domestic theater while clutching a manila folder containing every piece of evidence I'd gathered about their deception. My hands were steadier than I'd expected them to be. For 3 days, I'd been planning this confrontation, rehearsing what I would say and how I would say it. I'd considered waiting until they told me about Hawaii themselves, giving them the opportunity to include me, or at least explain their reasoning. But I'd realized that approach would only give them more time to craft lies and manipulate the situation to their advantage. Instead, I'd decided to control the timing and setting of this conversation. The children would leave for school in 15 minutes, giving us privacy for the discussion that would inevitably follow my revelations. Lisa would be late for work at the veterinary clinic, which might limit how long she could argue or deflect. David had a planning period first thing in the morning, so he wouldn't be able to claim he needed to rush off to teach. I'd positioned myself strategically at the head of the table, in the spot Tom used to occupy during family meals. It was a small psychological advantage, but I needed every edge I could get in what was about to become the most difficult conversation of my life. David, I said quietly, setting my coffee cup down with deliberate precision. I need to talk to you and Lisa about something important. After the children leave for school, David looked up from his newspaper with the mildly irritated expression he wore when interrupted during his morning routine. Sure, Mom. Is everything okay? You look a little pale this morning. His concern might have been genuine, but I could no longer trust my ability to distinguish between real emotion and performed caring from either of them. Everything they'd said and done for the past 3 months was now suspect, filtered through my new understanding of their capacity for long-term deception. I'm fine, I replied. We just need to discuss some family business that can't wait any longer. Lisa glanced over from where she was assembling sandwiches, her movements slowing slightly as she picked up on the tension in my voice. She'd always been more perceptive than David when it came to reading emotional undercurrents, which probably explained why she'd been the one managing most of the manipulation, while David remained blissfully unaware of how cruel their treatment of me had become. The children finished breakfast and gathered their belongings with typical preteen inefficiency. Emma kissed my cheek on her way out, telling me she'd see me after school and promising to show me her latest art project. Jake hugged me with the unself-conscious affection that always made my chest tight with love, reminding me to save him some of the cookies I'd promised to bake that afternoon. Their casual displays of affection made what I was about to do feel even more devastating. These children had no idea their parents were planning to remove me from their lives, no understanding that this might be one of our last normal mornings together. The innocence in their voices as they made plans that included me twisted the knife of betrayal even deeper. After the front door closed behind them, the kitchen fell into an expectant silence. David folded his newspaper and gave me his full attention, while Lisa finished cleaning the counter with movements that had become slightly jerky with nervousness. They could both sense that something significant was about to happen, but they had no idea I'd uncovered the full scope of their deception. I opened the manila folder and spread its contents across the table like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Mortgage documents, email printouts, text message screenshots, travel confirmations, and correspondence with Pine Valley Assisted Living created a damning display of their planning and lies. David's face went white as he recognized the documents, while Lisa actually took a step backward as if the papers might physically attack her. "I know about Hawaii," I said, my voice carrying a calm authority I hadn't felt in months. "I know about Pine Valley. I know about the timeline you've created for getting rid of me while you enjoy the vacation my money helped fund. I know about the emails, the planning, the coordination with Patricia. I know everything." The silence that followed my words was so complete, I could hear the refrigerator humming and the distant sound of traffic on Oak Ridge Drive. David and Lisa stood frozen, their faces cycling through expressions of shock, denial, and something that might have been relief that the charade was finally over. "Mom," David said finally, his voice cracking like a teenager's, "I can explain. It's not what you think." The automatic deflection, the instinctive move toward damage control rather than accountability, confirmed everything I'd suspected about his character. Even caught red-handed with undeniable evidence, his first instinct was to minimize and reframe, rather than accept responsibility for what they'd done. "David," I said, picking up the printout of Lisa's email to Pine Valley, "this is a 4-month correspondence about placing me in assisted living. This is not a recent decision based on concern for my welfare. This is a long-term plan that predates your invitation for me to sell my house and move in with you." I held up the travel confirmations next. "And this is a 2-week vacation to Hawaii that you've been planning since before I moved in, knowing you intended to dispose of me beforehand. You've calculated the timing down to the day, arranging for my relocation while you're conveniently out of state." Lisa found her voice, though it came out higher and more defensive than usual. "Kate, we were trying to find the best solution for everyone. You've seemed unhappy here, and we thought Pine Valley might offer you more social opportunities, more activities suited to your interests." The gaslighting was so blatant, so insulting to my intelligence that I almost laughed. Lisa was attempting to rewrite 3 months of history, to transform my growing awareness of their manipulation into evidence that I was the problem in our living arrangement. "Lisa," I said, pulling out the text messages she'd exchanged with Patricia, "here's what you actually wrote about my adjustment to living here. You described me as becoming difficult because I was asking questions about finances and seeming less grateful than you'd expected. You told Patricia that you were relieved I'd be gone before you returned from Hawaii, because dealing with my emotional reaction would be inconvenient." David sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. Lisa's face flushed red, then pale, as she realized the extent of evidence I'd accumulated. They'd been so confident in their superior planning and my trusting nature that they'd documented their deception extensively, never imagining I might discover their communications. "You went through my personal emails," Lisa said, her voice taking on an edge of outrage that was breathtaking in its audacity. "You violated my privacy, snooped through my private conversations. How could you do that to family?" Her attempt to position herself as the wronged party in this situation was so absurd that I felt my carefully maintained composure begin to crack. After months of systematic lies and financial manipulation, she was claiming moral high ground because I'd read emails that documented her betrayal of me. "Lisa," I replied, my voice becoming steel, "you and David took my life savings under false pretenses, planned to abandon me in assisted living without my consent, and have been lying to me for months about your intentions. I think my invasion of your email privacy is the least of our moral concerns here." David finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, we never meant for it to happen this way. The Hawaii trip, we'd been planning it since before you moved in. We couldn't cancel without losing the money we'd already put down." The explanation was so weak, so completely missing the point, that I wondered if he truly didn't understand the magnitude of what they'd done, or if he was simply grasping for any justification that might reduce his culpability. "David," I said, holding up the Pine Valley correspondence, "this isn't about a vacation conflict. This is about you systematically planning my removal from your family while pretending to include me. You researched assisted living facilities before you even asked me to sell my house. You coordinated with your sister about managing my emotional reaction. You structured our financial arrangement to give me no legal recourse when you decided I was no longer convenient." I stood up, needing the physical authority that came with height as I delivered the core of my accusation. "You didn't invite me to join your family. You recruited me to solve your housing problem and planned my disposal once I'd served your purpose. Everything else was performance designed to keep me compliant until you were ready to execute your timeline." Lisa's composure finally cracked completely. "We gave you a beautiful place to live, included you in our family activities, made you part of our household. We've been nothing but kind and generous, and this is how you repay us? By accusing us of some kind of conspiracy?" Her voice rose to near shouting, and I realized that on some level, she genuinely believed her own narrative. In her mind, they had been generous hosts who'd graciously allowed me to contribute to their household. The fact that I'd handed over my entire financial security based on their misrepresentations was irrelevant compared to the inconvenience my presence had caused them. "Kind and generous," I repeated, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more power than shouting. "You convinced me to sell the home I'd lived in for 45 years. You took my money under the pretense that I'd be a co-owner of this property. You planned my abandonment before I'd even finished unpacking. And you think a few family dinners and polite conversation constitute kindness?" David tried one more approach, appealing to the maternal bond he'd been exploiting all along. "Mom, you raised me to be honest and caring. Do you really think I'm capable of the kind of calculated cruelty you're describing? Maybe there's been a misunderstanding, some crossed wires in communication that made our planning seem worse than it was intended." The manipulation was expert, designed to make me doubt my own perceptions and feel guilty for questioning his motives. It was the same technique he'd used as a child when caught misbehaving, appealing to my love for him to override my judgment about his actions. But I was no longer the woman who'd moved in 3 months ago, desperate for family connection and willing to overlook red flags to maintain peace. I'd been forced to develop a clearer understanding of the difference between love and manipulation, between family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior. "David," I said, my voice heavy with the grief of lost illusions, "the boy I raised would never have done this. But the man sitting in front of me has spent months lying to my face while planning to dispose of me like an unwanted piece of furniture. So either I failed completely as a mother, or you've become someone I don't recognize anymore." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. David had always been proud of his relationship with me, had defined himself partially through his identity as a good son who took care of his mother. Forcing him to confront the contradiction between that self-image and his actual behavior was more devastating than any legal threat I could have made. Lisa, perhaps sensing that David was beginning to crumble under the weight of guilt, stepped forward to take control of the conversation. "Fine, Kate. You've caught us planning a vacation without you and researching senior living options. You want an apology? Fine, we're sorry we didn't handle this perfectly. But the fact remains that this living arrangement isn't working for anyone." Her pivot toward brutal honesty was almost refreshing after months of careful manipulation. But it also revealed the core of their problem with me, which had nothing to do with my behavior or needs, and everything to do with their desire for privacy and autonomy in their own home. "Not working for anyone?" I asked, raising my eyebrows. Emma and Jake seem perfectly happy to have me here. They include me in their daily routines, share their school experiences with me, seek my help with projects and problems. The only people this arrangement isn't working for are you and David, because having me here reminds you that you're not the generous benefactors you pretend to be. David looked up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said, settling back into my chair with the confidence of someone who'd finally stopped pretending, "that having me live here makes it harder for you to ignore the fact that you manipulated an elderly woman out of her life savings and independence. Every day you see me reminds you of what you've done, and guilt makes people cruel in ways they never expected." The psychological accuracy of my observation was evident in their reactions. David flinched as if I'd slapped him, while Lisa's jaw tightened with the anger of someone whose deepest motivations had been exposed and judged wanting. "That's not fair," David protested weakly. "We've tried to make you comfortable here, tried to include you in family life. You've tried to manage me," I corrected. "There's a difference between inclusion and management, between love and tolerance. You've been waiting for me to become grateful enough to accept whatever you decided was best for me, convenient enough to fit into your plans, without requiring any real sacrifice on your part." I gathered the evidence back into the manila folder, my movements deliberate and final. "Well, I'm done being managed. I'm done pretending that your manipulation constitutes family love. And I'm done protecting your feelings while you plan my disposal." Lisa stepped forward, her face flushed with anger that was finally honest instead of performed. "So what exactly do you want from us, Kate? An engraved apology? A legal contract guaranteeing your place in our home forever? What would it take to satisfy your sense of being wronged?" Her question revealed that she still didn't understand the fundamental issue. This wasn't about contractual terms or formal apologies. This was about basic human dignity, about being treated like a family member, rather than a financial resource to be exploited and discarded. "What I want, Lisa, is for you to acknowledge that what you've done is wrong. Not unfortunate, not poorly communicated, not the result of good intentions gone awry. Wrong. Cruel. Completely unacceptable behavior toward someone who trusted you enough to hand over their security and independence." I stood up again, needing to deliver my final statement from a position of strength. "I want you to cancel your Hawaii vacation and use that money to help me find appropriate housing. I want you to return whatever portion of my financial contribution you haven't already spent on your mortgage payments. And I want you to explain to Emma and Jake why their grandmother will no longer be living with them, using honest words instead of the carefully crafted explanations you've been preparing." The demands I'd laid out were both reasonable and devastating. Reasonable because they simply asked them to bear the consequences of their own choices, rather than forcing me to absorb all the costs of their deception. Devastating because they would require David and Lisa to sacrifice their comfort and face social judgment for their treatment of me. David and Lisa exchanged one of their married couple looks, and I could see them calculating whether it would be easier to comply with my demands or to simply accelerate their timeline for my removal. The fact that they were weighing options rather than immediately agreeing to make things right told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. "We need to discuss this privately," David said finally. "This is a lot to process, and we need to figure out the best way forward for everyone involved." The request for time to strategize rather than an immediate acknowledgement of wrongdoing confirmed my worst suspicions about their character. Even caught with undeniable evidence of their deception, their first instinct was to regroup and plan their next move, rather than to take responsibility and begin making amends. "You have until this evening," I said, my voice carrying an authority I hadn't known I possessed. "I've already spoken to an attorney about my legal options, and I've documented everything you've done. If you choose to continue down this path, I'll be forced to pursue more formal remedies that will be much more uncomfortable for everyone involved." The threat wasn't entirely bluff. While my legal options were limited, the potential for public embarrassment and social consequences was very real. David's reputation as a high school teacher could be damaged by revelations about how he'd treated his elderly mother. Lisa's standing in the veterinary community might suffer if her colleagues learned about her role in manipulating a vulnerable family member. After I delivered my ultimatum, I walked to my bedroom and closed the door with quiet finality. Behind me, I could hear David and Lisa beginning the urgent, whispered conversation that would determine whether our family relationships could be salvaged, or whether this confrontation would mark the permanent end of any connection between us. I sat on the edge of my bed, surrounded by the few possessions I'd been allowed to bring from my old life, and felt simultaneously powerful and terrified. I'd finally stood up for myself, finally refused to accept being treated as disposable. But I'd also potentially destroyed any chance of maintaining relationships with my grandchildren, the people I loved most in the world. The next few hours would determine whether my refusal to be manipulated would lead to justice and restored dignity, or whether it would simply accelerate the abandonment that David and Lisa had been planning all along. Either way, I'd finally stopped participating in my own humiliation, and that felt like a victory even if it turned out to be a costly one. The hours that followed my confrontation with David and Lisa stretched like an eternity. I could hear them in the kitchen, their voices rising and falling in urgent discussion punctuated by long silences that felt more ominous than their arguments. Occasionally, one of them would answer their phone, speaking in hushed tones that suggested they were consulting with others about how to handle the crisis I'd created by refusing to accept their manipulation quietly. I spent those hours pacing my bedroom, alternating between moments of fierce pride in standing up for myself and waves of terror about what I'd potentially lost. The photographs on my nightstand showed Emma and Jake at various stages of childhood, their faces bright with the kind of joy that comes from feeling completely loved and secure. The thought that I might never see those expressions again, that my refusal to be discarded might result in complete separation from the children who meant everything to me, made my chest tight with grief. Around noon, I heard the front door slam with enough force to rattle the windows. David's car started in the driveway, the engine revving with the kind of angry acceleration that suggested he was fleeing rather than simply running errands. Lisa's lighter footsteps moved through the house, and I could hear her making phone calls from different rooms, her voice too low for me to make out words but carrying the cadence of someone seeking advice or support. When Emma and Jake came home from school, the atmosphere in the house had changed completely. The comfortable family dynamic we'd maintained for months had been replaced by the kind of tense formality that children notice immediately, even when they don't understand its source. Emma knocked on my door as usual, but her usual cheerful chatter was subdued, replaced by careful questions about whether I was feeling well and if everything was okay. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I told her, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. "Just some grown-up business that your parents and I need to work through." Jake appeared in my doorway shortly after Emma left, his young face creased with the kind of worry that broke my heart. "Grandma Kate, are you and Mom and Dad having a fight? Everything feels weird. And nobody's talking normal." The innocence in his question made me realize how much damage the situation had already caused, regardless of how it was ultimately resolved. These children had grown accustomed to having me as part of their daily lives, and the tension between their parents and me was disrupting their sense of security in ways they couldn't fully understand. "Sometimes adults have disagreements that need to be worked out," I explained, pulling him into a hug that I tried not to make feel like goodbye. "It doesn't mean anybody loves you any less, and it doesn't mean anything is wrong with you or Emma. But it might mean you won't live with us anymore," Jake said with the devastating directness that only children possess. "Emma thinks Mom and Dad want you to move to one of those old people places." The fact that Emma had already figured out the broad strokes of the situation suggested that David and Lisa's discussions hadn't been as private as they'd intended. 16-year-olds were remarkably skilled at gathering information from overheard conversations and behavioral changes, and Emma had probably pieced together enough details to understand that my place in their household was in jeopardy. "I don't know what's going to happen yet," I told Jake honestly, "but I want you to know that whatever changes might come, my love for you and Emma will never change. You two are the most important people in my life, and that will always be true no matter where I live." Jake nodded seriously, though I could see tears gathering in his eyes. "Can you promise me something, Grandma Kate? Can you promise that if you do have to move away, you'll still come see us sometimes? And that you'll still help me with my art projects and remember my birthday?" The promises he was asking for were exactly the ones I couldn't make with any confidence. If this situation deteriorated completely, if David and Lisa decided to cut off contact rather than deal with the consequences of their deception, I might lose access to my grandchildren entirely. But looking at his trusting face, I couldn't burden him with the full weight of adult cruelty and selfishness. "I promise that I will do everything in my power to stay part of your life," I said carefully. "Some things might be beyond my control, but my love for you isn't one of them." David returned home just before dinner, his face set in the kind of grim determination that suggested decisions had been made during his absence. He avoided eye contact with me as he gathered Emma and Jake for what he called a family meeting, though his body language made it clear that I wasn't invited to participate. I remained in my room while they talked, though the house's thin walls meant I could hear most of the conversation. David's explanation to the children was a masterpiece of selective truth and emotional manipulation, presenting the situation as a mutual decision based on my desire for more independence and their family's need for privacy. "Grandma Kate has been thinking about her future," David told them, his voice carrying the kind of patient authority he probably used in his history classes. "She's realized that living with us isn't giving her the opportunities for social connection and activities that would make her happiest. There's a wonderful community called Pine Valley, where she could have her own apartment but also participate in group activities with people her own age." Emma's response was immediate and sharp. "Dad, that's not what Grandma Kate told me yesterday. She said she loves living here and being part of our daily routine. Why would she suddenly change her mind about wanting independence?" David's pause before answering was long enough to be audible, and I could picture him struggling to maintain his narrative in the face of Emma's skepticism. "Sometimes adults need time to figure out what they really want, Emma. Grandma Kate has been adjusting to a lot of changes since Grandpa Tom died, and she might need different things now than she thought she needed when she first moved in." But Jake wasn't satisfied with vague explanations either. "When is she moving? Can we visit her new place? Will she still come to my basketball games and help me with my science projects?" David's answers became increasingly evasive as the children pressed for specifics. He talked about transitions taking time, about everyone needing to adjust to new arrangements, about the importance of respecting Grandma Kate's decision to pursue what was best for her future. But he carefully avoided committing to any specific timeline or making any concrete promises about continued contact. The conversation ended with Emma storming upstairs and slamming her bedroom door, while Jake's muffled crying suggested he wasn't buying his father's careful explanations any more than his sister was. Lisa's voice joined the discussion briefly, adding reassurances about how proud they were of both children for being mature enough to understand that sometimes families had to make difficult decisions together. After the children were supposedly settled for the evening, David knocked on my bedroom door with the kind of tentative authority that suggested he'd rehearsed this conversation extensively during his afternoon absence. "Mom, we need to finish our discussion from this morning," he said, settling into the chair I usually used for reading. "Lisa and I have talked about your concerns, and we want to find a solution that works for everyone." The diplomatic language was carefully chosen to avoid any admission of wrongdoing, while suggesting willingness to negotiate. David had probably spent his afternoon consulting with friends or family members about how to handle my accusations without accepting legal or financial responsibility for their deception. "I've also been thinking," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "And I've realized that this situation has probably moved beyond the point where we can simply negotiate our way back to a comfortable family relationship." David's expression shifted slightly, and I could see him recalibrating his approach based on my response. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that trust, once broken on this scale, doesn't heal with apologies and compromises. You've demonstrated that you're willing to lie to me for months, to manipulate my emotions and exploit my loneliness, to plan my disposal while pretending to include me in your family. Those aren't mistakes or miscommunications. Those are character revelations." David flinched at my assessment, but he pressed forward with what was obviously a prepared response. "Mom, I know our handling of this situation has been far from perfect, but can't we focus on moving forward constructively rather than relitigating what's already happened?" The request to move past accountability toward practical solutions was predictable, but it confirmed my growing understanding that David was more concerned with minimizing consequences than with addressing the fundamental problems his behavior had created. "David," I said, leaning forward to make sure he was really listening, "the reason we can't just move forward constructively is that you haven't acknowledged what you've actually done. You're still treating this like a communication problem or a planning mistake, rather than a systematic betrayal of someone who trusted you completely." I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I'd taken of their documentation. These emails, these travel plans, these communications with assisted living facilities, they show months of deliberate deception. You researched my removal from your home before you even convinced me to sell my house. You coordinated with family members about managing my emotional reactions. You planned a vacation with money I helped provide while arranging for my abandonment. David studied the images on my phone screen, his face cycling through expressions of recognition, embarrassment, and something that might have been genuine remorse. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red with tears I hadn't seen since he was a child. "You're right," he said quietly. "We did plan this badly, and we weren't honest about our timeline or our intentions. But Mom, we weren't trying to hurt you. We were trying to solve a problem that seemed impossible, without someone getting hurt." The admission was more than I'd expected, but it still fell short of full accountability. David was acknowledging poor execution while avoiding responsibility for the fundamental cruelty of their approach. "What problem were you trying to solve, David?" I asked. "Because from my perspective, the only problem was that having me live here made you feel guilty about taking my money and uncomfortable about sharing your space." David's pause stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and I could see him struggling with whether to continue with partial honesty or risk full transparency about their motivations. "Lisa felt like we couldn't relax in our own home," he said finally. "She felt like every conversation had to be filtered through concern about your feelings. Every family decision had to account for your preferences. She said it was like having a house guest who couldn't leave, someone we had to be polite to all the time but couldn't really be ourselves around." The brutal honesty was both devastating and clarifying. Lisa hadn't just been planning my removal because of logistics or finances. She'd wanted me gone because my presence reminded her that their home had been purchased with money obtained through deception, and because including me in family decisions required acknowledging my legitimate stake in their household. "And you agreed with her assessment," I said. It wasn't a question. David's nod was barely perceptible, but it was enough. "I did. I love you, Mom, but I also love my wife and children. When Lisa said she couldn't be comfortable in her own home with you here, I had to choose between your happiness and hers." The choice he'd made was understandable from a certain perspective, but the method of implementation had been unnecessarily cruel. Instead of having an honest conversation about incompatible living arrangements, they'd chosen manipulation and abandonment as their tools for solving the problem I represented. "That's when you should have had a direct conversation with me about alternative arrangements," I said. "That's when you should have suggested I find my own place nearby, or offered to help me explore senior communities, or simply admitted that the extended family experiment wasn't working for everyone involved." David's face crumpled slightly. "We were afraid you'd be hurt, that you'd feel rejected or abandoned. We thought if we could present Pine Valley as an exciting opportunity, rather than as us wanting you gone, it would be easier for everyone." The paternalistic assumption that I couldn't handle honest communication about difficult topics was almost as insulting as the deception itself. They'd decided that managing my emotions was more important than respecting my autonomy, that their comfort with the process mattered more than my right to make informed decisions about my own life. "David," I said, my voice heavy with disappointment, "I'm 72 years old. I've buried a husband, raised 3 children, survived decades of challenges and changes. I'm not a fragile child who needs to be protected from difficult truths with elaborate lies." Our conversation was interrupted by Lisa's voice calling from downstairs. "David, you need to come here. We've got a problem." David looked at me with an expression that suggested our discussion would have to be continued later, but I was no longer willing to accept interruptions and delays as techniques for avoiding accountability. "Whatever problem Lisa has discovered can wait," I said firmly. "We're not finished talking." But David was already standing, his attention drawn toward whatever crisis his wife had uncovered. The automatic prioritization of Lisa's needs over our conversation told me everything I needed to know about where I ranked in his hierarchy of concerns. "Mom, I'm sorry, but I really do need to see what's wrong. Can we continue this later tonight?" The request for postponement felt like another manipulation, another way to control the timing and circumstances of conversations that made him uncomfortable. I realized that David would always find reasons to delay or avoid discussions that required him to confront the full consequences of his choices. No, David, we can't continue this later. Because every time we try to have this conversation, something more urgent comes up. Someone else's needs take priority, and my concerns get pushed aside until it's convenient for you to address them. I stood up, matching his movement toward the door. I'm done waiting for you to find time to treat my feelings as important. I'm done accepting that everyone else's comfort comes before my dignity. And I'm done pretending that your good intentions excuse the cruelty of your methods. David paused in the doorway, torn between responding to Lisa's summons and finishing our conversation. The internal conflict was visible on his face, and for a moment I hoped he might choose to prioritize our relationship over whatever emergency his wife had manufactured. But then Lisa called his name again, her voice carrying a note of genuine panic that made his choice for him. David gave me one last apologetic look before hurrying downstairs to respond to his wife's crisis, leaving me alone in my bedroom to contemplate the reality that I would never be the priority I'd hoped to become in their lives. The problem Lisa had discovered, as I learned from their urgent conversation in the kitchen, was that word of our family conflict had somehow reached other people in their social circle. David's sister, Patricia, had apparently received phone calls from mutual friends asking questions about my living situation and expressing concern about rumors they'd heard regarding my treatment. The social consequences they'd been hoping to avoid by managing my emotions and controlling the narrative about my departure were beginning to materialize anyway. Their careful planning was unraveling, and the embarrassment they'd tried to prevent was happening precisely because they'd chosen deception over honesty as their primary strategy. As I listened to them frantically trying to control information and manage their reputations, I realized that my confrontation had achieved something I hadn't expected. By refusing to quietly accept their manipulation, by demanding accountability and threatening to pursue formal remedies, I'd created enough disruption in their comfortable narrative to force them to face consequences they'd never anticipated. But I also realized that those consequences were falling on Emma and Jake as well. Children who were now living in a household filled with tension and uncertainty, because their parents had chosen cruelty over compassion in their treatment of their grandmother. The next few days would determine whether my refusal to be disposable would lead to justice and restored dignity, or whether it would simply accelerate the complete destruction of our family relationships. Either way, the comfortable lies that had sustained our household for 3 months were finally crumbling, and the truth about who we all really were was about to be revealed in ways that would change everything forever. The crisis that finally broke everything wide open came from an unexpected source. 3 days after my confrontation with David and Lisa, while we were all still navigating the uncomfortable tension that had settled over our household like a suffocating blanket, Emma made a decision that changed the trajectory of our entire family drama. I was sitting in my bedroom, staring out the window at the oak trees that had drawn me to this house in the first place, when I heard the front door open with unusual force. Emma's voice carried through the house with a tone I'd never heard from her before, sharp with teenage indignation and adult-level fury. "Dad, Mom, we need to talk right now," she announced, her footsteps heavy on the hardwood floors as she moved through the house looking for her parents. I heard David respond from his study and Lisa emerge from the laundry room, both of them asking what was wrong in the careful voices parents use when they sense their teenager is about to detonate. Emma's voice carried clearly from the living room as she confronted them with information that made my blood run cold. "I was at lunch today with Ashley, and her mom works at Pine Valley. Mrs. Richardson told Ashley that some woman had been making inquiries about placing her elderly mother-in-law there, asking about availability and whether they could arrange immediate admission for someone whose family was going on vacation." The silence that followed Emma's revelation was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. She'd uncovered their deception through the kind of random social connection that small towns specialize in, the coincidental conversation that reveals secrets people thought they'd kept carefully hidden. Ashley's mom described the whole situation to her because she thought it was sad that an old lady was being dropped off at assisted living while her family went to Hawaii, Emma continued, her voice rising with each word. She said it reminded her of those awful stories you hear about people abandoning their elderly relatives when they become inconvenient. David's attempt to interrupt was swift but ineffective. "Emma, that's not what," he began, but she cut him off with the kind of authority that comes from righteous anger and complete certainty about moral positions. Don't you dare try to lie to me again, Dad. I've been watching you and Mom act weird for days, whispering in corners and looking guilty every time Grandma Kate walks into a room. I heard you on the phone with Aunt Patricia talking about timing and logistics. I saw the travel confirmations on your desk when I was looking for a stapler. Emma had done her own investigation, piecing together evidence with the kind of determined intelligence that reminded me painfully of myself at that age. She'd been watching, listening, and drawing conclusions while her parents assumed she was too young or too distracted to notice their deception. And now I find out that you've been planning to dump Grandma Kate in assisted living while we go to Hawaii? Emma's voice cracked with emotion. How could you even think about doing something so horrible to someone who loves us and has never done anything but try to help our family? Lisa's response was predictably defensive. Emma, you don't understand the complexities of adult relationships and living arrangements. Sometimes what looks cruel from the outside is actually the kindest solution for everyone involved. The explanation Emma had been given was the same careful manipulation they'd tried to use on me, the suggestion that their cruelty was actually compassionate, and that only naive people would fail to understand the sophisticated reasoning behind their choices. But Emma wasn't buying it any more than I had. That's the biggest load of garbage I've ever heard, Mom. Grandma Kate has been nothing but wonderful to live with. She helps me with homework, listens to my problems, makes Jake feel special and important. The only reason you want her gone is because having her here makes you feel guilty about something. The accusation hit so close to the truth that I could practically hear David and Lisa flinching from my bedroom. Emma had identified the core issue with the kind of clarity that comes from observing family dynamics without being invested in protecting anyone's feelings or reputations. Jake's voice joined the conversation, small and confused but carrying his own weight of hurt. Are we really going to Hawaii without Grandma Kate? You told me she wanted to go to the old people place. But Emma says that's a lie. The innocent question from her 12-year-old brother seemed to shatter whatever composure Lisa had been maintaining. I could hear her voice break as she tried to explain their position without admitting to the deception Emma had already uncovered. Jake, sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about what's best for the whole family, even when those decisions hurt people's feelings in the short term. But Emma wasn't going to let her mother hide behind euphemisms and vague explanations. Stop talking to us like we're stupid little kids who can't handle the truth. You lied to Grandma Kate about being co-owners of this house. You took her money and planned to throw her away when she became inconvenient. And now you're lying to us about your reasons for wanting her gone. The confrontation continued for another 20 minutes, with Emma systematically dismantling every justification her parents offered, while Jake asked increasingly pointed questions that revealed how much both children had noticed and understood. David and Lisa found themselves defending actions they couldn't really justify to children who loved me unconditionally and saw their parents' behavior as fundamentally wrong. Finally, Emma delivered an ultimatum that surprised everyone, including me. If you go through with this plan, if you dump Grandma Kate in assisted living while we go to Hawaii, I'm not going. I'll stay here with her, or I'll go live with Aunt Patricia, or I'll figure out some other arrangement. But I won't be part of abandoning someone I love just because it's convenient for you. Jake's immediate agreement was even more devastating. Me too. I don't want to go to Hawaii if it means being mean to Grandma Kate. I'd rather stay here and help her move to a nice apartment where we can still visit her all the time. The children's rebellion against their parents' plan created a crisis that David and Lisa hadn't anticipated. They'd assumed that Emma and Jake could be managed with careful explanations and exciting distractions, that the promise of a Hawaiian vacation would outweigh any concerns about my treatment. Instead, they found themselves facing a complete family revolt. I heard David's footsteps on the stairs, and moments later he knocked on my bedroom door with the kind of defeated resignation that suggested major changes were about to occur. "Mom," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from my bed. "We need to talk, and this time I promise to be completely honest about everything." The promise of honesty would have meant more if it hadn't taken a teenage rebellion to extract it from him. But I was willing to listen if he was finally prepared to tell the truth about their motivations and intentions. Emma and Jake made it clear that they won't accept any plan that involves placing you in assisted living against your wishes, David began. They're prepared to boycott the Hawaii trip and create ongoing family conflict if we go through with our original timeline. The fact that his children's moral clarity had more influence over his decisions than my own confrontation was both gratifying and depressing. It suggested that David was more concerned with family harmony than with treating me ethically, but at least the result might be more favorable than I'd dared to hope. They also made it clear that they see our treatment of you as fundamentally wrong, regardless of our intentions or reasoning, David continued. And honestly, Mom, listening to Emma describe our planning from an outside perspective made me realize how cruel our approach has been. The admission was closer to real accountability than anything I'd heard from either David or Lisa since discovering their deception. But I was no longer satisfied with acknowledgments of poor judgment. I needed to understand whether they'd learned anything from this experience that might prevent future betrayals. David, I said carefully, I appreciate that you're finally being honest about how your planning looked to others. But I need to know whether you understand why what you did was wrong, not just unfortunate or poorly executed. David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with concepts he'd probably never had to examine closely before. We treated you like a problem to be solved rather than a person with rights and feelings, he said finally. We made decisions about your life without including you in the process. We lied to you about our intentions and manipulated your emotions to get what we wanted. The summary was accurate as far as it went, but it still felt somewhat detached, like a student reciting lessons he'd memorized, rather than expressing genuine understanding of the harm he'd caused. More than that, I said gently. You exploited my grief and loneliness to get access to my money. You promised me family connection and security, then planned to dispose of me when I became inconvenient. You treated my trust like a tool to be used rather than a gift to be honored. David's face crumpled, as the full weight of his actions finally seemed to register emotionally, rather than just intellectually. I know, Mom. God help me. I know what we did to you, and I don't know how to live with myself anymore. The breakdown felt genuine, but I'd been manipulated too thoroughly to trust emotional displays without seeing corresponding changes in behavior. Feeling guilty about hurting someone was different from taking responsibility for making things right. So what happens now? I asked. Do you and Lisa cancel your Hawaii vacation and pretend the last 3 months never happened? Do you suddenly include me in family decision-making and hope I forget about the assisted living research? Do you assume that an apology erases the consequences of systematically betraying someone who trusted you? David shook his head slowly. I don't think we can go back to the way things were, Mom. Too much has been damaged. Too much trust has been broken. But maybe we can figure out a way forward that respects everyone's needs and gives us a chance to rebuild some kind of relationship. The suggestion was more realistic than I'd expected, acknowledging that our family dynamics had been permanently altered rather than assuming we could simply return to previous patterns. But I was still waiting to hear specific proposals for addressing the practical problems their deception had created. Lisa appeared in my doorway before David could continue, her face showing the kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to maintain untenable positions under increasing pressure. She'd obviously been listening to our conversation, and her expression suggested she was ready to participate in negotiations, rather than continuing to defend their original plan. Kate, Lisa said, settling onto the edge of my bed with uncharacteristic humility. I owe you an apology that goes far deeper than just saying, I'm sorry for how we handled this situation. The acknowledgement was surprising coming from Lisa, who'd been the primary architect of their manipulation and the most resistant to accepting responsibility for its consequences. I convinced David that having you live here was going to solve all our financial problems while giving you the family connection you needed after Tom's death, Lisa continued. But honestly, I never intended for it to be a permanent arrangement. I always thought we'd find a way to transition you to independent senior living once you'd had time to adjust to your grief. The admission confirmed what I'd suspected about Lisa's motivations from the beginning. She'd never genuinely wanted me as part of their household, but she'd been willing to exploit my emotional needs to access my financial resources. But even if I always planned for this to be temporary, Lisa said, her voice becoming steadier. I should have been honest about that from the beginning. I should have presented it as a trial arrangement rather than making promises about shared ownership and permanent family connection that I never intended to keep. The honesty was painful but also oddly liberating. At least now I knew exactly where I stood with everyone involved, what their real feelings and intentions were beneath the careful politeness we'd been maintaining. Emma's voice came from the hallway, where she'd apparently been listening to our adult conversation with the determination of someone who'd appointed herself my advocate. "So what are you going to do to fix what you've broken? Because saying you're sorry isn't enough if you don't change anything about how you treat people." The question Emma posed was the one I'd been waiting to hear answered. Acknowledgement and apology were necessary steps, but they were meaningless without corresponding actions that demonstrated genuine change in attitude and behavior. David and Lisa exchanged one of their married couple looks, but this time it carried consultation rather than conspiracy. They'd obviously been discussing options during the crisis Emma had precipitated, trying to find solutions that might salvage something from the wreckage of their original plan. "We want to cancel the Hawaii trip," David said. "The money we would have spent on that vacation should go toward helping you find housing that you actually want, whether that's an apartment here in Riverside or somewhere else that appeals to you." Lisa nodded in agreement. "And we want to return whatever portion of your house sale money we can, even if it means taking out a loan against our mortgage. You shouldn't bear the financial cost of our poor planning and dishonest communication." The offers were more generous than I'd expected, suggesting that Emma's moral clarity had forced them to confront the practical implications of their behavior in ways my own confrontation hadn't achieved. But Emma wasn't satisfied with financial remedies alone. What about treating Grandma Kate like a real family member instead of a house guest you're trying to get rid of? What about including her in family decisions and vacations instead of planning around her like she's an obstacle? The questions Emma raised went to the heart of what I'd lost when I discovered their deception. It wasn't just about money or housing arrangements. It was about belonging, about being valued for myself rather than tolerated for my contributions. "Emma," Jake said from beside his sister, "can't Grandma Kate just stay here with us? I like having her in our family. She makes everything better." The innocent suggestion from my youngest grandchild created another moment of profound silence. Jake was proposing exactly what I'd originally thought David and Lisa were offering: genuine inclusion in their family life, rather than temporary accommodation while they planned my disposal. But I'd learned too much about their real feelings to believe that scenario could work anymore. Lisa's admission that she'd never intended our arrangement to be permanent, combined with her obvious discomfort with sharing her space, meant that staying would only create ongoing tension and resentment. "Jake, sweetheart," I said gently, "I love you and Emma more than anything in the world, and I love being part of your daily lives. But sometimes adults need to make changes that are hard but necessary for everyone's happiness." I looked at David and Lisa, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since this whole situation began. They weren't evil people, but they weren't the generous, loving family members I'd convinced myself they were either. They were ordinary people who'd made selfish choices and used manipulation to avoid dealing with the consequences honestly. "I think what I need is my own place here in Riverside, close enough to be part of your lives, but independent enough that everyone can relax and be themselves," I continued. "And I think what you need is to learn that family relationships require honesty and respect, even when honesty is uncomfortable." Over the following weeks, we worked together to find solutions that addressed everyone's needs without requiring anyone to pretend feelings they didn't have. David and Lisa found me a beautiful one-bedroom apartment in a complex specifically designed for active seniors, complete with community activities and transportation services. They used their Hawaii vacation money for my security deposit and first year's rent, and they arranged to return $30,000 from my original house contribution. More importantly, we established new patterns of interaction based on honesty rather than management. Emma and Jake visited my apartment regularly, and I attended their school events and family celebrations as their grandmother, rather than as a displaced houseguest trying to earn my keep. The relationship with David and Lisa remained careful and somewhat formal, but it was also genuine for the first time since I'd moved in with them. We'd all learned that love without respect was just another form of manipulation, and that family bonds could only survive when they were built on truth, rather than convenient fiction. 6 months later, as I sat in my own living room watching Emma help Jake with a science project at my kitchen table, I realized that losing the illusion of belonging had allowed me to find something more valuable: the reality of love that didn't require me to be anyone other than exactly who I was. Sometimes the worst betrayals become the catalyst for discovering strength you never knew you had and dignity you'd forgotten you deserved. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.